How many U.S. presidents have been assassinated?
Four American presidents were assassinated in office. Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln, 1809–1865, was shot on the evening of April 14, 1865, as he sat in the presidential box of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a performance of Our American Cousin. The man who fired the shot was actor John Wilkes Booth, 1838–1865. Who then jumped onto the stage, fell, breaking a leg, and limped away, calling out, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning thus always to tyrants. The president lived through the night, attended by family. He died just after 7 a.m. On April 15. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Andrew Johnson, 1808–1875. On April 26 the search party found Booth in a Virginia barn, where he was fatally shot. James Garfield, 1831–1881, was en route to a class reunion at Williams College, Williamstown, Massachusetts, on July 2, 1881, when his assailant fired 2 shots at him in a Washington, D.C. train station. The shooter was Charles J. Guiteau, 1841–1882, who held a grudge against the president. One of Guiteau's bullets had only grazed the president. The other was fixed in his back, and doctors were unable to locate it. Today the president's life might well have been spared, but the medical treatment of the late 1800s, which lacked both the X-ray machine and antiseptics, could not save him. He lived 80 days more, dying at a cottage on the New Jersey shore on September 19. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Chester Arthur, 1830–1886. Guiteau's trial lawyer would later claim that Garfield's assassin was insane. But it was an unsuccessful plea for his life. In 1882 he was convicted and hung. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley, 1843–1901, was attending a reception in Buffalo, New York, where the previous day he had delivered a speech. As he approached a man to shake his hand, the fellow fired 2 shots at McKinley. One bullet delivered only a minor flesh wound, but the other lodged in his stomach. Surgeons operated, but gangrene and infection set in, claiming the president's life the morning of September 14. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919. The shooter was identified as avowed anarchist Leon F. Cholgaz, 1873–1901, he was tried, convicted, and put to death in 1901. President John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, accompanied by his wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929–1994. Traveled in a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. They were en route to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to make a lunchtime speech. At 12:30 p.m., Shots rang out. The president, who was riding in the back seat of a convertible, was hit in the neck and head. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he died at 1 p.m. The nation's loss was immediately felt. As television and radio stations broadcast the message live that Kennedy had been shot and killed. He was succeeded by Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1908 to 1973. Who took the oath of office aboard an airplane just after 2:30 p.m. Additionally, there were assassination attempts on the lives of Presidents Andrew Jackson, April 14, 1835, Theodore Roosevelt, October 14, 1912, Franklin D. Roosevelt, February 15, 1933, Harry S. Truman, November 1, 1950, Gerald R. Ford, 2 attempts, both in September 1975, and Ronald Reagan, March 30, 1981. Theodore Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan recovered from their injuries. The others were not injured in the attempts.
Who were Leopold and Loeb?
Nathan Babe Leopold, 1904 to 1971, and Richard Dickey Loeb, 1905 to 1936, were privileged, well-educated, even brilliant young men who committed what they believed to be the perfect murder. Both were from well-to-do Chicago families. In May 1924, Loeb, then 18 years old, became the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan. He was to go on to postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. 19-year-old Leopold was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and a law student there. The two became friends, and, as testimony would later reveal, in the fall of 1923 became convinced that they could literally get away with murder, that they could plan it, carry it out, and never get caught. On May 21, 1924, the pair carried out their dastardly plan. Their victim was 14-year-old Bobby Franks, son of a millionaire and cousin to Loeb. Franks's body was found, as were a pair of eyeglasses belonging to Leopold. The spectacles were traced to him, and he and Loeb, who was part of Leopold's alibi, were grilled by the police. They stuck to their story for exactly 1 day. Then Loeb, believing Leopold had betrayed him, confessed. They were charged with murder and kidnapping. Under the counsel of noted defense attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938, who had been hired by their families, the pair pled guilty, reducing what would have otherwise been death sentences to life in prison plus 99 years. In 1936, Loeb was killed by a fellow prison inmate. In 1958, Leopold was freed. His sentence had been reduced by Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. In exchange for the inmate's contribution to testing for malaria during World War II, 1939-45. He lived out his life in Puerto Rico, where he married, earned a master's degree, performed charitable works, and taught.
When was paper money first used?
Paper money first appeared in China during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. In the 9th century AD, paper notes were used by Chinese merchants as certificates of exchange and later, for paying taxes to the government. It was not until the 11th century, also in China, that the notes were backed by deposits of silver and gold, called hard money.
Why is the court-martial of Billy Mitchell famous?
The 1925 military trial of William Billy Mitchell, 1879–1936. Made headlines because of the defendant's open and controversial criticism of the U.S. military. A U.S. general in World War I, 1914–18, Mitchell returned from the experience convinced that the future military strength of the country depended on air power. In fact, he had commanded the American Expeditionary Air Force during the war in Europe and had even proposed to General John Pershing that troops be dropped by parachute behind German lines. Pershing dismissed the idea. The war over, in 1921 Mitchell declared that the first battles of any future war will be air battles. But when the Navy and War Departments failed to develop an air service, Mitchell was outspoken about it, charging the military with incompetence, criminal negligence, and describing the administration as treasonable. Those were fighting words. Charged with insubordination and conduct of a nature to bring discredit upon the military service. Mitchell's trial began on October 28, 1925. After lengthy hearings, on December 17 of that year Mitchell was found guilty and was suspended without pay from the military for a period of 5 years. Congress entered the fray, proposing a joint resolution to restore Mitchell's rank. But President Calvin Coolidge, 1872–1933, upheld the court's decision. Mitchell responded by resigning. He returned to civilian life but continued to write and speak about his belief in an air force. He died in 1936, about 5 years too soon to see his predictions come true. In surprise air raids on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked U.S. military installations in the Philippines and Hawaii, though the U.S. military rose to the occasion. Entering World War II and building an impressive and mighty air fleet, many observers felt the military could have been better prepared to stage that monumental effort had Mitchell's advice been heeded years earlier.
What were pieces of 8?
Pieces of 8 were Spanish silver coins, pesos, that circulated along with other hard currency in the American colonies. Since the settlements in the New World were all possessions of their mother countries, England, Spain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, they did not have monetary systems of their own. England forbade its American colonies to issue money. Colonists used whatever foreign currency they could get their hands on. Pieces of 8, from Spain, reals, from Spain and Portugal, and shillings, from England, were in circulation. The pieces of 8 were most common. The Spanish silver coin was so named because it was worth 8 reals and at one time had an 8 stamped on it. To make change, the coin was cut up to resemble pieces of a pie. 2 pieces, or 2 bits, of the silver coin made up a quarter. Which is why Americans still refer to a quarter, of a dollar, as 2 bits. There were frequent money shortages in the colonies, which usually ran a trade deficit with Europe. The colonies supplied raw goods to Europe, but finished goods, including manufactured items, were mostly imported, resulting in an imbalance of trade. With coinage scarce, most colonists conducted trade as barter, exchanging goods and services for the same. In 1652 Massachusetts became the first colony to mint its own coins. That year there was no monarch on the throne of England. Although the issue of coinage by colonists was strictly prohibited by England, the Puritans of Massachusetts continued to make their own coins for some 30 years thereafter, stamping the year 1652 on them as a way to circumvent the law.
What is rag money?
Rag money is a derisive term for paper currency. The name comes from the early days of paper money, when paper itself was predominantly made with the cotton and linen fibers from rags. Hence, bills were rag money. Given that valued currency was issued in silver or gold coins by the established governments of Europe, it is not surprising that Americans greeted paper currency, which is nothing more than a promise of future payment in coin, as something to be regarded with skepticism. After the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the first bills that were issued by the U.S. government quickly became worthless. In its effort to fund the American Revolution, 1775–83, the Second Continental Congress printed so many bills, called Continentals, that there was not enough silver to back them up. The financial crisis that emerged did nothing to inspire American confidence in paper currency. Rag money continued to have its detractors even after the revolution had been financed by European loans, and the U.S. government established the dollar as its unit of currency, 1785.
Was Mata Hari really a spy?
When Dutch-born Margaretha Zell MacLeod, 1876–1917, was arrested in Paris on February 13, 1917. There was scant hard evidence that this woman, known throughout Europe as Mata Hari, was actually a spy for the Germans during World War I. 1914-18, but there was plenty of evidence that she had long consorted with the enemy and had been paid by them, but for exactly what was never discovered. Nevertheless, the testimony heard by the jury over 2 days in July in a closed Parisian courtroom was enough to convince them that this former exotic dancer, who could count as her lovers a who's who of European men, was, in fact, a spy. She was sentenced to death at age 18, the result of a matrimonial advertisement. She married a middle-aged colonial captain in the Dutch army, John Rudolph Campbell MacLeod. He was posted to duty on the island of Java, where his young and beautiful wife, now 21 years old, learned not only the Malay language, but native dances as well. Her Javanese friends named her Matahari, meaning the Eye of the Dawn. Upon returning to Holland, Matahari secured a separation from her husband and moved to Paris, where she enjoyed a life of excess and soon became known as an exotic Hindu dancer. She performed throughout Europe, all the while engaging in liaisons with powerful and wealthy men. In 1914 she moved to Germany, where she is believed to have been trained as a spy in Antwerp. With World War I on, Matahari returned to Paris. She was permitted to enter France since she owned property there and was a citizen of neutral Holland. She renewed her ties with men of influence and in that capacity collected information for the Germans. The Allied nations kept a close eye on her, and, suspecting her of espionage, set a trap for her. She became a double agent. The French sent her to Spain to work, but there she reportedly met regularly with German intelligence agents. When the Germans ordered her back to Paris, Allied officials having intercepted a German cable for her awaited her return. They arrested Matahari, who was found in possession of a check from the Germans. At her trial, a report compiled by the French and holding Matahari responsible for the deaths of some 50,000 Allied soldiers, was brought into evidence. She was killed by firing squad on October 15, 1917, the war still more than a year from ending.
What was the importance of Hitler's beer hall putsch trial?
The 1924 trial of German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and 9 other men charged with treason for their attempted coup, in German, Putsch, of late 1923, marked the beginning of Hitler's seemingly unstoppable rise to power. As the leader of the Nazi Party, National Socialist's German Workers' Party, Hitler had gained enough of a following to believe that on the night of November 8, 1923, as Bavarian leader Gustav von Kahr spoke in a Munich beer hall, Hitler and his followers, all of them determined to recreate a powerful German Empire and rid it of its mongrel-like quality, could topple the weak German government merely by demonstrating that the Nazis, and not the official government, had gained the support of the people. But in a march through Munich the following day, The still loyal Germany Regular Army and the Bavarian State Police opened fire on the Nazi demonstrators and their sympathizers, killing 16 and arresting Hitler and his 9 co-conspirators. Their trial began on February 26, 1924, over the course of 25 days. Aided by radio and newspaper coverage, Hitler held forth, in one case taking 4 hours to respond to a single question, earning him the overwhelming support of the German people. His impassioned appeals turned what ought to have been an open and closed case of treason against him into an indictment of the German government. His basic argument was this: I cannot declare myself guilty. True, I confess to the deed, but I do not confess to the crime of high treason. There can be no question in an action which aims to undo the betrayal of this country. In 1918, Hitler was referring to the German surrender in World War I, 1914-18. Nevertheless, he and 9 others were convicted of treason. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, where he wrote the first volume of his infamous work Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which revealed his frightening theories of racial supremacy and his belief in the Third Reich. Released after only 9 months, Hitler walked out of prison more popular than he had been before his highly publicized trial.
Why do historians draw comparisons among Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great?
All 4 men were fiercely powerful and seemingly indomitable leaders, and their early lives and careers shared some interesting characteristics as well. First, none of them were native sons of the countries they ended up ruling, and some would say, defining. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1879-1953, was born in Georgia. German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889-1945, in Austria. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769-1821, in Corsica, which, though technically a new possession of France, was decidedly more Italian in nature. And King of the Macedonians Alexander the Great, 356-323 BC, was from the fringe city-state of Macedonia. Yet it was, respectively, Russian, German, French, and Greek culture that each leader spread. All 4 men rose to power through the military, or, in Alexander's case, who succeeded his father, after having carried out military strategy. Once installed as rulers, all led fantastic military campaigns to expand their spheres of influence. The wars brought on by their nationalism left millions dead. Finally, all 4 men inspired, and some would say continue to inspire, terror in the human soul. Still, history has been more forgiving of both Alexander and Napoleon, who today seem to be portrayed as often as heroes as they are as megalomaniacs. With Hitler's and Stalin's horrible legacies a more recent memory, the view of these men is decidedly and far more consistently dark and loathsome.
What is mercantilism?
An economic system that developed as feudalism was dissolving, at the end of the Middle Ages 500-1350. Mercantilism advocates strict government control of the national economy. Its adherents believe a healthy economy can only be achieved through state regulation. The goals were to accumulate bullion, gold or silver bars, establish a favorable balance of trade with other countries, develop the nation's agricultural concerns, as well as its manufacturing concerns, and establish foreign trading policies.
What were wildcat banks?
Wildcat banks were state-chartered financial institutions that operated in the United States from the early 1800s until the American Civil War, 1861-65. They were known as wildcat banks for their free lending policies and their issue of paper currency that could not be backed up by gold or silver, called specie. The Second National Bank of the United States operated between 1816 and 1836, during which time the federally controlled bank was able to restrain the wildcat institutions, which predominated in the West and South, requiring them to issue only what currency they could convert to coin. But when the charter of the Second National Bank of the United States was allowed to expire in 1836, the wildcat banks resumed their unsound banking practices. Paper currency issue and lending went unregulated amidst a rush to buy lands on the frontier. The nation's currency wildly fluctuated as the renegade financial institutions loosened and tightened the money supply to suit their own needs. Further, since there were so many banks issuing their own notes, another problem introduced itself: counterfeiting. No one could tell what was true bank currency and what was the product of a good counterfeiter. With inflation rampant and land speculation at a new high, on July 11, 1836, President Andrew Jackson, 1767-1845, intent on reining in the wildcat banks, issued the Specie Circular, an order that government agents accept nothing but gold or silver as payment for new lands. When prospective land buyers, particularly in the West, took their paper bills to the state-chartered banks to be converted to coin, they found the banks' tills were empty, and the holders were therefore denied the face value of their notes. Bank after bank closed its doors, causing a financial panic in 1837. But many state banks remained in business, and the issue of regulating paper currency continued to trouble the nation.
Who was Adam Smith?
Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723-1790, is popular with conservative economists today because of his work titled The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, which proposes a system of natural liberty in trade and commerce, in other words, a free market economy. Smith, who was teaching at the University of Glasgow at the time, wrote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer." The wealth of nations established the classical school of political economy, but has been faulted for showing no awareness of the developing industrial revolution. While Smith advocated both free market competition and limited government intervention, he also viewed unemployment as a necessary evil to keep costs and therefore prices in check.
What is Keynesian economics?
Keynesian economics are the collected theories of British economist and monetary expert John Maynard Keynes. 1883 to 1946, who in 1935 published his landmark work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. A macroeconomist, he studied a nation's economy as a whole. Keynes departed from many of the concepts of a free market economy in order to ensure growth and stability. He argued that government needs to be involved in certain aspects of the nation's economic life. He believed in state intervention in fiscal policies, and during recessionary times he favored deficit spending, the loosening of monetary policies, and government public works programs, such as those of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, to promote employment. Keynes's theories are considered the most influential economic formulation of the 20th century. Having played a central role in British war financing during World War II, 1939–45. Keynes participated in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, where he helped win support for the creation of the World Bank, which was established in 1945 as a specialized agency of the United Nations. The body aims to further economic development by guaranteeing loans to nations, extending easy credit terms to developing nations, and providing risk capital to promote private enterprise in less developed nations. It's interesting to note that Keynes was a key representative at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles was drawn up, officially ending World War I, 1914–18. He quit the proceedings in Paris, returned to private life in London, and in 1919 published The Economic Consequences of Peace, in which he argued against the excessive war reparations that the treaty required of Germany. Keynes foresaw that the extreme punishment of Germany at the end of World War I would pave the way for future conflict in Europe.
What are greenbacks?
Greenbacks are the paper money printed and issued by the U.S. government during the Civil War. The financial demands of the war quickly depleted the nation's supply of specie, gold and silver. In response, the government passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which suspended specie payments and provided for the issue of paper money. Legal tender is money that must be accepted in payment of any debt. Since the bills were supported only by the government's promise to pay, it was somewhat derisively observed that they were backed only by the green ink they were printed with. Hence the name greenbacks. The value of the notes depended on the people's confidence in the U.S. government and its future ability to convert the currency to coin. As the fighting between the Union and the Confederacy raged, Americans' confidence in their government fluctuated. When the Union suffered defeat, the value of the greenbacks dropped one time to as low as 35 cents on the dollar. Greenbacks remained in circulation after the fighting ended, finally regaining their full value in 1878. After the financial crisis in 1873, many people, particularly Western farmers, clamored for the government to issue more. Advocates of the monetary system formed the Greenback Party, which was active in American politics. Between 1876 and 1884, they believed that by putting more greenbacks into circulation, the U.S. government would make it easier for debts to be paid and prices would go up, resulting in prosperity. The country's present-day system of paper money is based on the government's issue of notes, which was made necessary by the Civil War.
What were the gulags?
Gulags were prisons for political dissidents in the Soviet Union. The prisons existed from 1919 into the 1950s. Gulag is an abbreviation of the Russian name of the system. Globnoye upravilnye ispravitelno trudovik lagary, which translates to Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. The camps were first used during the collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Under Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's 1879–1953 purges of the 1930s, anyone who posed or seemed to pose a threat to his hardline communist regime was rounded up and sent to a gulag. During World War II, 1939–45, prisoners of war were held in the gulags. And after the war, Stalin continued to use the camps to punish those who opposed him. Though exact figures are unknown, it is believed that as many as 30 million people were imprisoned in gulags, where they faced forced labor, grueling conditions, and maltreatment including starvation. Official Soviet figures place the number around 10 million. Millions are believed to have died in the gulags. After Stalin died in 1953, the system was dismantled, with some of the prisoners receiving amnesty.
What was the monkey trial?
The July 1925 trial of Dayton, Tennessee, public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900–1970, was dubbed the monkey trial because at issue was Scopes's teaching of evolution in his classroom. Having yielded to religious beliefs in creationism, the story of human origins told in the Bible's book of Genesis. Tennessee state law prohibited teaching public school students about the theories of English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809–1882. Darwin's scientifically credible work The Origin of Species argued that humans had descended from ape-like creatures. Celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857–1938, defended Scopes. Lawyer and former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, 1860–1925, known as the Great Commoner, argued the prosecution. For 12 days in the summer of 1925, the small town in eastern Tennessee became the site of a showdown between modern scientific thought and traditional fundamentalism. Or as some observed, between cosmopolitan and rural America. Spectators crowded the courtroom, eventually forcing the proceedings to be moved to the courthouse lawn. Journalists issued daily reports, which were published in newspapers across the country. It was headline writers who dubbed the case the monkey trial. Darrow made history when he called Bryan himself to the stand. It was a daring move on the defense attorney's part. But since Bryan eagerly accepted the summons, the judge allowed the questioning. Darrow first got Bryan to agree that every word in the Bible is true. Then he set in to reveal the hazards of such a literal interpretation, asking, for example, how Cain had found himself a wife if he, Adam, Eve, and Abel were the only 4 people on earth at the time. Darrow succeeded in shaking the prosecutor, who finally admitted that he did not believe Earth was made in 6 days. Bryan retaliated by accusing Darrow of insulting the Bible, to which Darrow replied, "I am examining you on your fool ideas that no Christian on earth believes." It was drama better than any novelist could write. Darrow lost the case, which was later overturned on a technicality. Scopes had only been charged a $100 fine for violating the state law, which was repealed in 1967. But the trial, preserved in the play and film Inherit the Wind, is still remembered today. Scopes's crime was not sensational, his trial did not break any legal ground, and the defense had not won a brilliant victory, but the proceedings, carried out in the midsummer heat of the American South, epitomized the era and, ultimately, made for a great story.
Are the Bushes the first father-son presidents?
No, the nation's 41st, George H. W. Bush, and 43rd, George W. Bush, presidents were preceded as father-son presidents by John Adams, 1735–1826, the second President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, 1767–1848, the sixth. There have been other presidents whose relatives held the office before them: Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president, was the grandson of the nation's ninth, William Henry Harrison. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, and James Madison, the 4th, were second cousins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preceded in the office by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Genealogists determined that FDR had ties to 10 other presidents as well. 4 of them were blood relatives and 6 were relatives by marriage: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, James Madison, William Howard Taft, Zachary Taylor, Martin Van Buren, and George Washington.
What is the Federal Reserve?
It is the central banking system in the United States, created by a 1913 Act of Congress. The Federal Reserve Act, sometimes called the Glass-Owens Bill. The legislation provided for a stable central banking system after the system set up by the National Bank Act of 1863 proved ineffective in managing the nation's currency. In responding to economic growth, or in exerting a controlling influence on the economy. The Federal Reserve Act created 12 regional Federal Reserve Banks, in Boston, Massachusetts, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago, St. Louis, Missouri, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Kansas City, Missouri, Dallas, Texas, and San Francisco, California. These institutions operate as bankers' banks, member banks, commercial institutions. Use their accounts with the Federal Reserve in the same way that consumers use their accounts on deposit at commercial banks. All national banks must be members of the Federal Reserve System. State banks may join the system upon meeting certain requirements. The Federal Reserve Act also established a Federal Reserve Board, now called the Board of Governors, to supervise the system. The board consists of 7 members who are appointed by the President of the United States and are approved by the Senate. To reduce the possibility of nearsighted political influence, members serve staggered 14-year terms. One of the 14 terms expires every other year. The duties of the Federal Reserve include lending money to commercial, member, banks, directing the Reserve Bank's purchase and sale of U.S. government securities on the open market, setting reserve requirements, for how much money needs to be in the U.S. Treasury, and regulating the discount rate, the interest rate the Federal Reserve charges commercial banks for loans, which is one of the system's principal influences on the economy. In performing these duties, the Federal Reserve, often called the Fed in financial circles, can expand, loosen, or contract, tighten, the supply of money in circulation. The Federal Reserve also issues the national currency and supervises and regulates the activities of banks and their holding companies. It began operation in November 1914. The central bank systems of other developed nations include the Bank of Canada, Banque de France, and the Deutsche Bundesbank, of Germany.
What was the Long March?
The Long March began in October 1934 when Mao Zedong, 1893–1976, led Chinese Communist forces. The Red Army of China, numbering 100,000 men and women, on an epic walk across China, with the Nationalist Army in pursuit. The Communist marchers crossed 18 mountain chains and 24 rivers to cover 6,000 miles. Almost all women and children died along the way. In 1935, 20,000 to 30,000 people finally reached Shaanxi, Shenxi, province in the north, where the Red Army established a stronghold. It was there that Mao, one of the earliest members of the Chinese Communist Party, formulated his own philosophy that came to be known as Maoism. He had adapted Marxism to the Chinese conditions, replacing German politician and socialist Karl Marx's 1818 to 1883 urban working class with the peasant farmers as the force behind revolution. The Red Army went on to defeat the Nationalists in 1949. Mao was named Chairman of the People's Republic of China, a communist state, that same year.
What was the Iran-Contra affair?
It was a series of actions on the part of U.S. federal government officials, which came to light in November 1986. The discoveries had the immediate effect of hurting President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, whose policy of anti-terrorism had been undermined by activities initiated from his own executive office. Following in-depth hearings and investigations into who knew what, when, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, 1912, submitted his report on January 18, 1994. Stating that the dealings with Iran and with the Contra rebels in Nicaragua had violated United States policy and law. The tangled string of events involved Reagan's national security advisors Robert McFarlane, 1937, and Admiral John Poindexter, 1936, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, 1943. Poindexter's military aid, the Iranian government, and Nicaraguan rebels. The U.S. officials evidently had begun their dealings with both the Iranian government and the Nicaraguan rebels with the goal of freeing 7 Americans who were held hostage by Iranian-backed rebels in Lebanon. President Reagan had met with the families of the captives and was naturally concerned about the hostage situation. Under pressure to work to free the hostages, McFarlane, Poindexter, and North arranged to sell an estimated $30 million in spare parts and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran, then at war with neighboring Iraq. In return, the Iranian government would put pressure on the terrorist groups to release the Americans. Profits from the arms sale to Iran were then diverted by Lieutenant North to the Contras in Central America who were fighting the dictatorial Nicaraguan government. Congress had already passed laws that prohibited U.S. government aid to the Nicaraguan rebels. The diversion of funds certainly appeared to violate those laws. The Iran-Contra affair led to North's dismissal and to Poindexter's resignation. Both men were prosecuted, though the hostages were freed. Reagan's public image was seriously damaged by how the release had been achieved. During the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, National Security Commission officials revealed that they had been willing to take the risk of providing arms to Iran in exchange for the safe release of the hostages because they all remembered the U.S. government's failed attempt in 1980 to rescue hostages held at the American Embassy in Tehran, Iran. Nevertheless, the deal with Iran had supplied a hostile country with American arms that could then be used against the United States. In 1987 Iran did launch an offensive when it attacked Kuwaiti oil tankers that were registered as American and laid mines in the Persian Gulf. The United States responded by sending in the Navy, which attacked Iranian patrol boats. During this military initiative, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down a civilian passenger jet, killing everyone on board.
Why was Susan B. Anthony tried?
Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1896, was tried for violating federal voting laws. The suffrage movement was in full swing in 1872 when Anthony and 14 female companions went to the Rochester, New York, voter registration office and demanded to be registered. When the officials refused, Anthony argued with them, showing them the written opinion of a Judge Henry R. Selden, who agreed with her, and others, that the 14th Amendment 1868 also protects women's rights, including the right to vote. She threatened the registrars that she would sue them if they did not allow her to participate in elections. They gave in and the women signed up to vote. On election day, November 5, they did just that. 23 days later, all 15 women were arrested for having done so. Bail was set, and eventually all the women were released. The following June, Anthony's trial got underway. The U.S. District Attorney presented the government's case against her. She had upon the 5th day of November 1872, voted. At which time she was a woman. She was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine of $100. In another act of civil disobedience, Anthony refused to pay it, saying, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." In the coming years, the nation's courts continued to narrowly interpret the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, to the exclusion of women. Anthony died 24 years before American women were granted suffrage. After the 19th Amendment was made in 1920.
How was the United Nations formed?
Officially, the United Nations, UN, was not formed until October 1945. However, events during World War II, 1939–45, had paved the way for the founding of the international peacekeeping organization that today is so familiar to people around the globe. Fervent German nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and his troops invaded Poland in 1939. And soon Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Leaders of 9 nations: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia met with Britain and its Commonwealth states in London. There, on June 12, 1941, the countries signed the Inter-Allied Declaration, vowing to work together for a free world. 2 months later, on August 14, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882–1945, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, signed the Atlantic Charter. In it the two leaders outlined their aims for peace. On January 1, 1942, the declaration by the United Nations was signed by 26 countries who pledged to work together to fight the Axis powers: Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they agreed not to make peace separately. The term United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, is believed to have originated with Roosevelt. In late November and early December 1943, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, met in Tehran, Iran, for the first time during the war. There these Allied nations leaders cited the responsibility of a United Nations organization in keeping the peace once the war was over. Though ending the war was first and foremost in the minds of these leaders, all had seen 2 world wars fought in close succession and were determined that the nations of the world could work together to prevent such an event from happening again. In August 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China met to make plans for the peacekeeping organization that had been envisioned. The outcome of that meeting, which lasted into October, was the basic concept for the UN Security Council as we know it, with the world's 5 major powers having permanent seats on the council and a limited and rotating membership beyond that. When the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference, in the Soviet Union, in February 1945, they discussed matters that were central to ending the fighting with Germany and with Japan. But Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also announced that a conference of the United Nations would open in San Francisco on April 25 of that year. Having directed the United States' massive war effort, Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II or the creation of the international peacekeeping body. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 7. And during the closing days of World War II, the UN was chartered. The representatives of the Allied nations met as promised in San Francisco. On June 26, 1945, the governing treaty was signed by the delegates. On October 24, 1945, shortly after the war ended with Japan, the United Nations officially came into existence when the required number of nations approved the charter. 50 nations were members of the UN at the outset. Today the membership numbers 191.
Why were the Rosenbergs tried?
Husband and wife Julius, 1918 to 1953, and Ethel Rosenberg, 1915 to 1953, were tried for conspiracy to commit wartime espionage. Arrested in 1950, the Rosenbergs were charged with passing nuclear weapons data to the Soviets, enabling the Communists to develop and explode their own atomic bomb, an event that had been announced to the American public by President Truman on September 23, 1949. As the realization set in that the United States could now be the victim of an atomic attack, the anxieties of the Cold War heightened.
When were ATMs introduced?
The ubiquitous automatic teller machine, ATM, was introduced in 1967 by Britain's Barclays Bank at a branch near London. 2 years later, the Chemical Bank opened the first ATM in the United States, at Rockville Center, New York. Self-service banking grew steadily in the 1980s and took off in the 1990s, when some banks began charging their customers for banking through tellers rather than ATMs.
When were ATMs introduced?
The ubiquitous automatic teller machine, ATM, was introduced in 1967 by Britain's Barclays Bank at a branch near London. 2 years later, the Chemical Bank opened the first ATM in the United States, at Rockville Center, New York. Self-service banking grew steadily in the 1980s and took off in the 1990s, when some banks began charging their customers for banking through tellers rather than ATMs.
When was the euro introduced?
The euro, the currency of the 12 European Union nations: Belgium, Germany, Greece, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, and Finland went into circulation January 1, 2002, becoming part of daily life for more than 300 million people. The banknotes and coins replaced national currencies, making the franc, Deutschmark, peseta, and lira, among others, history in the participating nations. The euro's origins can be traced to a series of international agreements. Beginning in 1978, which were made among the members of what was then called the European Community, or EC. In February 1986 the framework for the unified monetary system was agreed upon by nations who signed the Single European Act, creating an area without internal frontiers, in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. The 1989 Delors report outlined a plan to introduce the currency in 3 phases. The final phase of that plan began on January 1, 1999, when the 11 countries, later to become 12, belonging to the European Union established the conversion rates between their respective national currencies and the euro, creating a monetary union with a single currency. A 3-year transition phase followed, during which monetary transactions could be made in euro, but there was no requirement to do so. On January 1, 2002, the central banks of the 12 participating countries put into circulation about 7.8 billion euro notes and 40.4 billion euro coins, together worth 144 billion euros. Simultaneously each country began to withdraw its own currency from circulation. By February 28, 2002, the changeover was complete, meaning the national currencies were completely withdrawn and only the euro was in circulation. When 10 new nations, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, joined the EU on May 1, 2004, there was no timetable for their adoption of the euro. Previously, in 2003, Sweden voted against joining the euro area.
When was the euro introduced?
The euro, the currency of the 12 European Union nations Belgium, Germany, Greece, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, and Finland went into circulation January 1, 2002, becoming part of daily life for more than 300 million people. The banknotes and coins replaced national currencies, making the franc, Deutschmark, peseta, and lira, among others, history in the participating nations. The euro's origins can be traced to a series of international agreements. Beginning in 1978, which were made among the members of what was then called the European Community, or EC. In February 1986 the framework for the unified monetary system was agreed upon by nations who signed the Single European Act, creating an area without internal frontiers, in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. The 1989 Delors report outlined a plan to introduce the currency in 3 phases. The final phase of that plan began on January 1, 1999, when the 11 countries, later to become 12, belonging to the European Union established the conversion rates between their respective national currencies and the euro, creating a monetary union with a single currency. A 3-year transition phase followed, during which monetary transactions could be made in euro, but there was no requirement to do so. On January 1, 2002, the central banks of the 12 participating countries put into circulation about 7.8 billion euro notes and 40.4 billion euro coins, together worth 144 billion euros. Simultaneously, each country began to withdraw its own currency from circulation. By February 28, 2002, the changeover was complete, meaning the national currencies were completely withdrawn and only the euro was in circulation. When 10 new nations, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, joined the EU on May 1, 2004, there was no timetable for their adoption of the euro. Previously, in 2003, Sweden voted against joining the euro area.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618, the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
What was triangular trade?
Triangular trade refers to the various navigation routes that emerged during the colonial period. There were numerous triangular paths that ships traveled. Ferrying people, goods, both raw and finished, and livestock. The most common triangular route began on Africa's west coast where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners, and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits, and traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the triangle began again. 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the triangle began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the capture of Africans and their forced migration to the Western Hemisphere.
What was triangular trade?
Triangular trade refers to the various navigation routes that emerged during the colonial period. There were numerous triangular paths that ships traveled. Ferrying people, goods, both raw and finished, and livestock. The most common triangular route began on Africa's west coast where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners. And traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits, and traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the triangle began again. 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the triangle began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the capture of Africans and their forced migration to the Western Hemisphere.